Hello everyone, welcome back for another vodcast, this time on tissues. So we'll be looking at the major tissues of the body in two parts. By the time you finish A&P, you should be able to explain what everything in the body is in terms of tissues. Everything in the body is a tissue with a few exceptions. There's a couple of fluids like cerebrospinal fluid, endolymph, and urine that are not tissues. But everything else that you're going to see is a tissue. Let's remember what this looks like in terms of organization. Tissues are made up of cells, and so a group of cells with a common function are going to be making this tissue, and it takes tissues to make organs. Two or more tissue types make up an organ. So when you look at an organ, there's various tissue types in here. The major tissue types of the body that make up organs are epithelial tissue, connective tissue, muscle tissue, and nervous tissue. So everything's going to fall into one of those groups of tissues, four main tissue types, in the body. Something to keep in mind is that when you look for tissues on a slide, it's probably going to be in a preparation that comes from an organ. So there will be more than one tissue type, and part of your job is going to be figuring out what part of what you're looking at is the tissue in question. So again, we have our four tissue types, and in most organs in the human body, you'll have all four tissue types. There will be a little bit of everything. This is a good example. This is a cross section of the small intestine, and we have epithelial tissue lining space. That's how you're going to mostly find it. We have connective tissue, a specific variety of it here, deep to the epithelial tissue. We have smooth muscle tissue that's going to help move things through the small intestine. And we have another epithelial tissue lining the superficial side of this organ, lining space. So again, you see 3 out of 4 here. What we're not at this magnification able to see is the nervous tissue, but there is definitely nervous tissue here. All of these groups, the 4 main tissue types, have specific tissues in them. So there's a lot of different types of epithelial tissue, a lot of different types of connective tissue, muscle tissue, nervous tissue. But these are the 4 main tissue types of the body. And we're going to look at those and learn a little bit about the structure and the function of each of them as a group. You'll look in lab at more specific tissues and be learning some of their specific functions. We're going to start with nervous tissue. And the function of nervous tissue, this goes back to homeostasis, folks, because nervous tissue's main job is maintaining homeostasis. And it does so by controlling. It's a regulatory system. And in order to carry this out, it has to coordinate with other systems in the body, including our other regulatory system, the endocrine system, and it has to communicate. So those are the main functions. In terms of structure, we have 2 cell populations. We have neurons and we have neuroglia cells. The neurons are the communicating cells. These are the ones that send the message. We call that signal transmission. It's electrical events. You'll learn all about that later. These are excitable cells because they have those electrical events. And in this artist's rendition, you can see that they have a large cell body and then processes or sticky out parts that help carry out the neuron's function. And these are generally very, very big cells. They are highly adapted to these jobs, though, so we need a whole bunch of other cells to take care of the rest of the business. If you want to think about it this way, neurons are the divas, and they sing for their supper, and they need an entourage. The neuroglia, or glial cells, are our entourage, and they take care of basic housekeeping, maintaining the tissue. They insulate, they defend, they provide some structure, and they can line spaces, providing a bit of a barrier. This is a neuron as you might see it in lab. And the dark spots, little tiny dark spots you see around it, are the nuclei of the much smaller neuroglia cells. So our next tissue type is muscle tissue. And muscle tissue is always about movement. Whether it's moving the body through space or moving things through the body, the main function of muscle is movement. The cells have a function of contraction because that's how we get movement, by contracting. And skeletal muscle in particular is important for producing heat for the body. There's three main types of muscle tissue: skeletal muscle tissue, smooth muscle tissue, and cardiac muscle tissue. When you're identifying muscle tissue, you should be saying one of these names. It's going to be very rare that you were to, say, put an answer on a quiz or a test, that you would want to write muscle and that would be sufficient answer. Usually it will not be sufficient answer. It should be skeletal muscle or smooth muscle or cardiac muscle. So keep that in mind. Skeletal muscle is one of the hugest cells you are going to see in the human body. It's very, very long and cylindrical and striated, meaning it has these kind of stripes on it, as you can see in both of these pictures. Another thing you might notice here is in each picture we have these dark, long bits, and these are the nuclei. Nuclei tend to follow the shape of the cell. So whereas in introductory biology you may have seen a lot of round nuclei, these cells are very, very long, and as we see in a lot of cells, the nuclei tend to follow that shape. But what you might be wondering is why you're seeing so many, because if you got the feeling that this is one cell, which it is, then it would have several visible nuclei, two in this case, two here. If we look at this one down here, quite a few nuclei visible. And this is not a common thing, but skeletal muscle cells are multinucleate. And these nuclei, multiple nuclei, and the size of the cell is an indication that these are what we call a structural syncytium. These cells have gotten very, very, very big and have many nuclei. Basically making it many cells that are one cell, and that's the meaning of structural syncytium. Skeletal muscles attach to bone and they move the body through space. You see here a muscle organ made of many, many muscle cells along with some other tissues that you'll explore more later. Cardiac muscle is also a type of syncytium, interestingly enough. It's a functional syncytium. These cells are much smaller than skeletal muscle cells, and they are branchy. Cardiac muscle is found only in the heart, and it's going to be the tissue that allows the heart to contract, building pressure so we can pump blood around the body. So it helps us to move blood. We have here a whole bunch of branched cells so they can connect to more than one other cardiac muscle cell. And when you study the heart, you'll see why that is. And you'll also find out what an intercalated disc is. But we find these marking cardiac muscle cells, these darker lines where two cells meet. And the structures in the cell membrane here take the stain more deeply, so we see it as a line, even though what it really is a whole bunch of structures concentrated here, specifically gap junctions and desmosomes, if you remember those. Because of the gap junctions on these cells, there are windows between them, basically, where things can run straight through, allowing these cells, even though they are separate cells, to act as one huge cell. So they are a functional syncytium. Another thing you might notice when you look at these microscopically is there are, believe it or not, striations. In this picture and in this picture, you can kind of see some lines, but they're a little disordered, and they're not all nice and straight and true like soldiers in a line like we see in skeletal muscle. But these are arranged anatomically very much like skeletal muscle cells. There are striations, even if they're a bit messy. That's not true of smooth muscle. Our final muscle tissue is smooth muscle, and smooth muscle we find lining hollow organs, and they help us to move things through the body, blood through the vessels, food through the digestive system, urine through the urinary system, reproductive materials get moved along by all this by smooth muscle. These cells are spindle-shaped, and they're arranged differently inside than the other two, so there are no striations whatsoever. You can see how important the spindle shape is as they come together to form the sheets of tissue that we find lining the hollow organs. Not that you should get the idea these are thin sheets. They have substance, as you can see in these pictures. And when we put them together like this, one thing you'll notice is it does look smooth. So look for that on slides when you look at it in lab. In this second picture, we have another cross section of the digestive tract, and the part that is smooth muscle is highlighted by these yellow brackets. So those are the groups of muscle tissue in the human body. So far with nervous and muscle tissue, we can visit pretty much everything. That's not going to be true of epithelial tissue. There are quite a number of specific epithelial tissues, and you'll meet quite a few of them in lab, but it's a large group. You see a long list of functions here, and I'll tell you, no one epithelial tissue carries out all of them. But between all the different specific epithelial tissues, we see these functions somewhere. So protection can take the form of the cells lining the stomach that don't allow acid to go back into other tissues of the body, or the surface of the skin, which is an epithelial tissue, keeping the outside out. Some of the epithelial tissues are good at absorption. The lining of the small intestine is an excellent example of this, absorbing nutrients from the food we digest. Some of these tissues will be good at secretion. We can still be in the GI system for that. Think about the stomach secreting acid and enzymes to digest protein. Filtration is another function, and we see this, for example, in the kidneys, where we filter the blood to produce urine. And we could look to the kidneys as well for excretion, because we have cells that will excrete unwanted things into the urine, as this is fine-tuned so that it can be ejected from the body. Now, a lot of these epithelial tissues also have nerve endings in them. So while the epithelial cells are not able to carry out sensory function, which is a nervous function, because the nerve endings are in between them, the tissue itself has some sensory function. So we may see sensory reception as well. One thing you're going to see about almost every epithelial tissue you ever look at is that it lines space. And in this micrograph here, you can see an epithelial tissue. This is a pseudostratified columnar epithelial tissue. But what's next to it? Space. Keep this in mind for lab. These tend to be very thin tissues. This is about 1000x power. So we're highly magnified here, and it looks like a reasonably thick tissue, but it is exceedingly thin. And you can see on the other side, we are meeting another tissue. If we look up here, we'll see how this is. Epithelial tissues are made up of cells that come in single layers, or less often in multiple layers. And one side is facing space. This is called the apical surface. The other side is attached to another tissue. And where they meet, the epithelial cells have produced some cell product that forms a basement membrane. But the basement membrane is on the basal side, and the basal side is always attached to another tissue. Again, apical surface, always a free surface, meaning it lines space. So to find an epithelial tissue, first look for the space, folks. And we're lining all the body cavities or external surfaces. Anywhere there is space, we're going to line it with epithelial tissue. And this picture shows you just a few versions of it and a few places you might find it. The only exception to this is when epithelial tissue makes glands. The glands of our bodies are made of epithelial tissues, and we'll look at that in lecture. And yes, it is the same for apes. All right, thank you very much for paying attention to Tissues Part 1. Come back soon for Tissues Part 2.